Hello, everyone. Welcome back. So our first order of business today is, do we have a bondholder who I owe money to? In fact, she had emailed me saying that she has another appointment and can't come, but I want to make sure that everyone's aware that I do pay my debts, and as soon as she comes and collects it, look, money, there's money. I don't want anyone saying Ivan doesn't pay his debts. You can say Ivan's a wanker, that's fine, but I should pay my debts. In other news, I am hoping by the end of the week you'll have your exams back and you can check and make sure you get the score that you're expecting. If you don't get the score that you're expecting, you should come talk to me because it's read by machines, and machines can make mistakes, unlike humans who never make mistakes. But machines can make mistakes too. Our robot overlords are also prone to mistakes, and so, if you're not getting what you expect, it could be just misread, and so you should come talk to me. Okay. So where were we? We were starting ISLM. Yeah.
So you posted like a homework 5 there.
Uh-huh.
Like some of us, we don't have another tutorial. Like how are we supposed to?
You don't have another tutorial. Don't you have them next week as well?
Not on my calendar.
Not on your calendar. I will look into that. Okay, I assumed you had one next week, and so I did it accordingly. I will make sure that you're not disadvantaged accordingly. But thank you. I will look into it. I'm shocked. But yeah, so if that's the case, we'll just have you be able to send them in and do it, because what else can you do? Right, so there's a good point. I will check. Yeah, there I am, feeling like everything's under control and now, tutorials. But, okay, I'll look into it. Okay. Other business? Yeah, so we should be able to cover ISLM today and Friday, maybe a bit on Wednesday, but I think this week we should be able to cover it. And so next week will be review, discussion, you guys coming in with questions about the exam. I'll talk about the exam and all that kind of thing. Okay. One thing that you do know already is 50% of your exam is like these homeworks, a Fisher-Gray problem where you're going to talk about why the answer is the way it is, guess the answer, and then solve it mathematically. Okay. It'll look very, very, very much like the homeworks you've had. Okay. And the practice problem I'm going to put up soon. Okay. So I don't think anyone will be surprised what's on it. It will, of course, be different in some way. It won't be exactly the same. The assumptions will be slightly different. Memorizing the answer won't get it for you, but doing it, understanding it, and keep doing it until you can do it without reference to the answer key, and do that for all of them. And I don't think you'll have any trouble at all. Okay? This is my intention anyway. On the other hand, and this is important, is the kind of thing that is impossible the first time you do it, hard the second time you do it, you get confused the third time you do it, and then it becomes easy, right? So the fact that you look at it, I have no clue what to do, that's normal. The fact that you get confused what you're doing while you're doing it, that again is normal. You have to do it. There's no substitute for you taking out your own piece of paper and doing it yourself. You can read it, can make perfect sense. You try to do it is a totally different thing. You have to do it, you have to get stuck, you have to come back to it, which means you can't put it off till 2 days before the exam because there's not enough time for it to soak in. You will be screwed. It's just the facts. In mathematical things, it won't take you a huge amount of time to study it, but you do have to get on it early so you can work on it for 45 minutes, be stuck, wander around, come back to it the next day, come back to it a few more times, right? Not huge amounts of aggregate time, but you need the time coming back multiple times to do it. You can't, or most of us can't do it the day before and do well. Okay, so I know like all the professors will say, I study early and all that. I'm a big procrastinator myself. As a student, I put everything off to the last minute. I certainly don't blame other people for being like me, although you could be better. You could be better than me. That would be nice. But yeah, I don't like to judge you, but this is one thing that is really, really hard to learn at the last minute. Okay? Hard to do well. It is not hard to learn, but it does involve some getting stuck, some frustration. It does. But I'm hoping and intend, and tell me if I'm wrong, that if you put in the time, like not lots of time, but time multiple times, and come back to it, come back again, that it will become easy fairly quickly, but it won't become easy the night before. Okay. Okay. And you know, 50% of your exam is that, so, it's a thing. Okay. So it wouldn't be macro if we didn't have computer problems. Obviously, macro is computer problems as far as I'm concerned. And so we're back on the handwritten misery that is our life. And let me get it so it's being recorded. That at least would be good. Okay. Yes? No? Yeah, there we go. Okay, now it's being recorded. Okay, so we're looking at ISLM. And the ISLM model, if you can see that, yes you can, is about bringing together the financial markets with the goods market. So the IS is investment savings. This is the goods market. And LM is the financial markets. In our case, a very simple financial market was just the money market. Okay, so we're going to bring those two together. We had them separately. We talked vaguely about the linkages last year, but we didn't bring them together. And the importance of this model is one of those things. You can't overstate it, and also you can't understate it. Like it is not, no one buys it as the true model of the economy. On the other hand, it keeps spitting out the right answer. Like you can have a super complicated model, and this one is going to give the same answer as this one. It's just going to be complicated. And so this is what macroeconomists use as sort of their back of the envelope. What do I think is going to happen? And then they go in and they look at it in more detail, and it almost always comes out to the same answers you got from ISLM. And so in that sense, it's very handy. It's also very handy because it is the back of the envelope model that gives you the right answer all the time. It is sort of one of the common pieces of knowledge amongst macroeconomists. So if you come out of university and you haven't seen ISLM, you can't talk to the other guys. It's one of those things that is sort of a foundational thing. Even though people don't buy the assumptions of it particularly, it's still, you need to know. So we're going to spend the week, and then you'll know, and that'll be awesome. Right. Okay, so we were talking about the IS curve. So our first bit is just IS. Right. And this, if we had a pen that wrote, would be even better. This is equilibrium in the goods market. So we're looking at the goods market, and we're looking for places where we have equilibrium. And so what we're going to do is I'm going to put the goods market at the top. And this goods market is just that Keynesian cross diagram that we had last year. I know there's a few of you who haven't had the last year. Again, there's a chapter in the book that goes over that. But it is just, we have Y, which is GDP. So this is, we're thinking of this at the moment as income and output. Recall there's three ways to think about GDP. It can be income, it can be output, and it can be expenditure. Because if I produce something and sell it to you, the value of what I produced is just equal to the value of what you spent, which is just equal to the value of what I got. Okay, so these things have to be the same for the economy as a whole, not for any individual. So we're thinking of it here in terms of income. And the idea is, here we're going to put expenditure. Right, the idea is, if I have more income, I'm going to buy more stuff. Right? This is our deep insight into human psychology. People with more income buy more stuff. And so our expenditure line, planned aggregate expenditure. Okay, PAE, planned aggregate expenditure. This is upward sloping. And importantly, it has two features. It has, and this is, by the way, just C plus I plus G plus net exports. The same GDP that we know and love that we see everywhere, right? It's dividing it up. C plus I plus G plus net exports. Okay? It has two features. One feature is that the slope is less than 1. It's greater than 0, and it's less than 1. Okay? That is, if we get a little more income, we spend some of it, and we save some of it. Right? And in fact, the slope is the marginal propensity to consume. The extra amount that we consume if we get a little more income. Okay? More generally, we could have income in the investment and stuff as well, but we haven't done that, and it's not important here. The important thing here is that it has a slope less than 1. If you get more income, you spend more, so it goes up. It's a positive slope. But as you get more income, you don't spend all of it, you save some of it. Okay? Maybe you don't, but on aggregate, people in society do. Okay? And the other important thing is that even if we have no income, we still have some spending. This is our autonomous spending, the spending that doesn't depend on income. And that sounds weird, but remember, people have savings, right? And so even if we have no income, we're still going to buy stuff out of our savings. So this isn't our wealth, it's our income, which is a different thing, right? I just think of it like a little snotty things to say about UK, which is unfair to the UK. We're going to leave them alone. We're going to leave them alone. We're not going to talk about their great wealth from the slave trade or any of that stuff. Current income. So this is our basic story. And then we have equilibrium. What does equilibrium look like? Well, we know we're looking at our income, and that determines our spending. But also spending determines output, right? Because they're not going to produce anything if we're not buying stuff. So our expenditure has to be equal to Y as well. And so that gives us planned aggregate expenditure equals Y. And this comes from the same thing. In the economy as a whole, the amount that we spend has to be equal to the amount that other people get as income, which is equal to the amount that's produced. Right? So there's really 3 ways of thinking about GDP, thinking about Y. There's the expenditure, there's the income, and there's the output. And they're all the 3 the same for the economy as a whole, but we've separated them out. And that's because for individuals, they're separated out, right? When you're deciding how much stuff to buy, you're not thinking, well, what is GDP? And let me decide whether or not to buy something based on GDP. No, you're just looking at your own personal income, deciding whether to buy. And you can easily spend more than your income. You can easily spend less than your income. But for the economy as a whole, if we're not spending, then they're not going to produce the stuff, right? And so our spending determines output. So in the end, in equilibrium, this has to be true. Right? And so where is equilibrium? Well, it's the magic point where these things cross. And this is Y in our economy. Okay? So that's what we had last year. And then we said, well, if things change, if our investment changes, this line's going to shift. If government spending changes, this line's going to shift. And that's all true. But what we want to do now is we want to tie this into the financial markets. And our connection between the goods market and the financial market is going to be the interest rate. Okay? We can have many connections, but this is the one we're going to focus on in this model. That is, the amount of goods that we produce, sure, it depends on our income and it depends on how much we're spending and all that, which is what's shown in the graph. But it also depends on the financial situation and particularly the interest rate. And the way we're going to bring it in is we're going to change investment to be investment as a function of the interest rate. Investment is going to depend on the interest rate. And we're going to say that if the interest rate goes up, then investment goes down. Okay? So why is that? Why do we think that we have this connection? We're thinking about firms here. Firms are doing the investment, by and large. There's also the housing market, right? So we can think about the housing market. Let's do it with the housing market, right? We said purchasing of housing is an investment. And it goes into the investment category because individuals who are buying houses are thinking very much like firms do when they're buying factories. They're thinking about the long-term repercussions of this. Right? And so you're thinking about buying a house. If the interest rate is higher, that means it's more expensive to borrow money to buy that house. And so you're less likely to buy the house than if the interest rate was low. Right? If the interest rate is low, you're going to be more likely to buy a house because it's cheap to buy a house. If the interest rate is high, you're going to find it expensive to buy a house. You won't buy as much. We can think about a firm. Let's think about a firm that has lots of money. So we're thinking about Apple Computer or one of these guys. They're just sitting on a big pile of money. And they're thinking, should I build a factory or should I put my wealth into something that bears interest? Right? Because remember, we're thinking about investment is purchasing real stuff or something that increases output, increases productivity in the future. Right? That's investment. And so it's a different definition of investment than in English. In English, you would say, do I want to invest in bonds? Right? That would be normal. But for us, that's not investment. That's shifting paper around. Right? So just because it brings you an income in the future doesn't mean it's investment. Investment, for it to be called investment for us, it has to increase productivity in the future. Right? And so the firm is thinking, should I loan this money to somebody, buying a bond, or should I build a factory? And it's comparing those two things. And if it buys a bond and it loans that money to somebody, they're going to pay at the interest rate. Right? And so if the interest rate is high, it's really attractive to take your big pile of wealth and loan it out to somebody, which is not investment. It's just moving paper around. Very nice for the firm. They're going to get rich on it. It's lovely for them. But it means they're not going to build the factory with that money because they're loaning it to someone, because loaning it to someone is so attractive because of the high interest rate. Right? Likewise, we can think of a firm that doesn't have any cash, so they're not sitting on a big pile of money, and they're thinking, should I buy a factory or not? Well, if I buy a factory, I don't have any cash, so I have to borrow money for it. And so the cost of the factory is in part the interest rate, just like the guy buying a house. If you're going to borrow the money, a high interest rate means it's more expensive to buy the factory, more expensive to buy the house, and so you're less likely to do that. So the higher the interest rate, the more of our wealth is going to go into these paper assets rather than interest-bearing assets, rather than doing something that increases productivity, buying a factory, buying a house, etc. Okay? So the higher the interest rate, the more attractive those other things are, and therefore the less investment we've got. Okay? That's going to be our story. And that's going to be our connection between the goods market and the money market, the financial markets. It's going to determine how much investment comes about. So we're thinking sort of in the back of our head that interest rates are determined in the financial market, and this is going to determine how much investment that we've got. So when I drew this curve, this planned aggregate expenditure curve, I must have had some interest rate in mind. Right? Whenever we draw these graphs, what we're doing is we're saying, keep everything the same, and just change this one thing, just change income. Right? So we said, if I have low income, what do I do? If I have high income, what do I do? And we're keeping everything else in the world the same. Because the world is always complicated, but we have a two-dimensional board to put it on. And so we can only say, how does one thing affect one other thing? We can't, in our graph, do more than those two things. So we're saying, how does income affect planned expenditure? Right? And so to do that, to do it on our graph, we had to keep everything else constant. For example, this graph was drawn for a particular level of government spending. Right? Government spending is whatever it is, and then we just changed our income and we moved along the curve. Right? So if any of the millions of other things that affect people's expenditure change, that's going to shift this curve. Okay? So to draw this curve, we must have been saying, take a particular interest rate and draw this curve. So let's suppose we said, take interest rate equal 3%. And we drew this curve. And all this curve was for interest rate equals 3%. We picked it. Determining that interest rate determined the investment. And then we could draw this curve, saying if we have no income with this interest rate, how much do we spend? If we have high income with this interest rate, how much do we spend? But that whole thing was drawn for a particular level of the interest rate, and also particular government spending and particular net exports. Right? We just take all those things as given, and then just changed income, and we got this curve. Okay? So what that means is that if the interest rate is 3%, this is the level of output that we're going to get. Okay? So given this 3% interest rate, now we know how many goods are going to be produced in this economy. Okay? And now we can start drawing our IS curve. Now I'm going to draw the IS curve down below, like vertically down below and deliberately down below, because on this axis I'm going to put y. This is the same y we've got here. So I'm just carrying it down and graphing it below because I want to see how this y compares with a y down here. And so what we've done is we've said, suppose the interest rate is 3%. I just picked that out of the air. Like it's completely arbitrary. But suppose it was 3%. And then we went up there and we said, OK, if it's 3%, no, you can't see this. And that makes it even harder to tell what's going on. If it's 3%, then we found out what output is like. So if the interest rate is 3%, we now know that this is the level of output. And so 3% interest rate is associated with this level of output. Right? Everything else staying the same. Okay. But I didn't have to try 3%. I could try, for example, 2%. What the hell? Why not? Live a little. Try 2% interest rate. Okay. So suppose I say 2%. And I say, well, what about 2%? Huh? Riddle me that. What's up with 2%? You gave me 3%. What about 2? Let's try 2. If interest rates, for some reason, we don't know why, but for some reason, interest rates fall down to 2%. Well, that makes investment more attractive, right? Because some firms were loaning people money because of the attractive 3% interest rate. But now the interest rates are lower, and they say, that's a sucker's game. Let me buy a van instead, right? And they do some actual investment rather than just shifting paper around, because now shifting paper around is less attractive. So what this means is that if we redrew this graph, and I'm just going to carry it back up to up here, with a 2% interest rate, investment will be higher. So if we had 0 income, we would now invest more, and that is part of planned aggregate expenditure, right? Investment went up. And so for 0 income, before we bought this much, now we're going to buy more. Likewise, with this level of income, before we bought that much, now we're going to buy more. With this level of income, before we bought that much, now we're going to buy more. Right? Because investment has gone up, this whole planned aggregate expenditure line has shifted vertically up. And so now, this is planned aggregate expenditure given interest rate equals 2%. There's just more investment. We lowered the interest rate. Financial stuff looks less attractive. Now they put their wealth into real stuff. Or they're borrowing. Before it was, they had a project that was going to give them a 2.5% return. It wasn't worth borrowing at 3% for that, but it is worth borrowing at 2%. So they do that project, whereas before they weren't doing that project. Okay. So we get, with this new lower interest rate, we get a new level of output here. Y with 2%. This was Y with 3%. Now we've got Y with 2% interest rate, so we can carry that down, and we can say, if the interest rate is 2%, now we know what output is. Okay? So for a lower interest rate, we get higher output, and I've just graphed it there. Okay? Let me do one more, just for fun. Suppose the interest rate went up to 5%. Suppose the interest rate goes up to 5%. Then all of a sudden, this 2.5% project, the project that gave me a return of 2.5%, is no longer attractive. I would much rather loan somebody money and get 5%. Right? So a lot of things that were doing productive activity before are now going into the financial market, and we're just shifting paper around. because it's more attractive. It's great for the guys that are loaning the money, but it's not giving us investment. Right? So investment is going to fall. And if I get another graph, we're going to have a new line here, which is planned aggregate expenditure. Given that interest rate is 5%, it's going to be lower than the 3% line. Okay, so what's going on here? Saying, well, when the interest rate was 3% and we had zero income, we wanted to spend this amount, this vertical amount. But now that the interest rate is higher, investment has gone down. So if we have zero income, we're going to spend less than before. Right? So we get that point. When the interest rate was 3%, before we wanted to spend this much. Right? When income was this. When income was this and the interest rate was 3%, we wanted to spend that much. Now we want to spend less. So this whole curve shifts down, and we get a new equilibrium here. So we carry that down, and when we have 5% interest rate, this becomes the output. Okay. So what we're doing is we're just going through, keeping everything else the same, keeping government spending the same, keeping exports the same, trying out different interest rates. And the higher we make the interest rate, the lower the equilibrium level of output, because investments falls. And of course, there's the multiplier and all that going on in the background as well. Right? And so I can connect up all these dots like so, and that is what we're going to call the IS curve. Okay. All the combinations of I and Y so that the goods market is in equilibrium. And importantly, I'm going to write this down just to emphasize it. Given particular levels for G and net exports. If I can, zooming out a thing? Yeah, that helps. Okay. Given particular levels, because we didn't play around with G, right? Government spending can change too. But we didn't play around with that. We just took G as given, right? So given G, we played around with interest rates, and we traced all those out. Every time we had a new interest rate, it gave us a new planned aggregate expenditure line. But that brought down, and we just traced all those out for the IS curve. So we tried everything. We tried interest rates equal 10 million%, interest rates equal 50%, interest rates equal 5%, interest rates equal negative 12%. We tried every possible interest rates, the reasonable ones, the unreasonable ones, all of them. We traced out what the equilibrium looks like, and it's this downward sloping line. Okay? I drew it kind of bow. We don't know anything about that, but we know it's downward sloping, right? Because as interest rates go up, investment falls, which lowers output. Right. So it's a downward sloping line. The higher we make interest rates, the less output we've got. Any questions about this so far? Okay. So that's lovely. This is how the financial market affects the goods market, keeping everything else constant. Okay. Now I want to spend a little bit of time talking about what if everything else isn't constant. We're going to do the LM curve, obviously. But before we get there, let's talk about what happens if, for example, government spending changes. Okay? If government spending changes, this IS curve is going to shift. Right? Because we drew that curve holding everything else constant. And in particular, we were holding government spending and net exports constant. So keeping all those things constant, we just played around with the interest rate, and that gave us the output. But if we change any of those things, just like every graph in economics, if you change anything that matters that isn't part of your graph, it's going to shift your graph. And your graph can only include two things because of the dimensionality of our blackboard and our paper. Okay, it's just the technological problem that we got with this. Like, ideally, we'd have an n-dimensional thing and we could just graph out the whole space, and that'd be lovely. But good luck to you trying to understand that n-dimensional graph. Like, I have at times, like of great insight and drug use, been able to look at a 3-dimensional graph and figure out what was going on. But 4-dimensional graphs, I don't even know how to draw it, right? So clearly, we're going to have to deal with these shifts. But it's important to realize that these shifts are coming about not really because something is changing, we're always in equilibrium, but they're coming about because we can't graph all the dimensions that we would like to graph. Right? We would like to also have a dimension coming out here with government spending as well. And then it would be a whole sort of plane thing coming down. And I would try to draw that for you, but you would all laugh at me and it would not be helpful. So I'm not going to do that. But you can imagine that if we had coming out here government spending, that would be another thing that affected equilibrium G. And then we'd have a whole kind of maybe bowed thing, or who knows what the shape would be. But it would be some kind of plane that was our set of stuff. But because we don't have that, it's going to look like when we change G, we're shifting this curve because we're just moving it to a different line on that plane, different way of cutting that plane. Okay? I'm looking at you. I'm wondering if that was helpful. I believe there's 2 people in the room for which that was helpful. I'm like, I don't know that it's important that there was, but yeah, okay. If that's not you, don't worry about it. It's fine. But yeah, that's how I like to think about it. Okay? I can't imagine the plane, but I can imagine that there is a plane. All right. Okay. So what we want to do is we want to change G, and we want to see how this curve shifts. Okay, so to do this, I'm going to redraw the thing. And instead of drawing every point, I'm just going to draw one point. And we're going to see how that one point moves. Because you can see, like to draw this curve, I had to draw 3 of these, at least 3 of these different expenditures for different interest rates. And if the curve's going to shift, then I'm going to have like 6 of them, 3 for each curve, right? And that's going to be hard to keep track of. And you can see my 3 is messy enough. We don't need 6 on one graph. That's not going to be helpful. So here's what I'm going to do. Make this page 1. Get to page 2. Okay, so I'm going to draw this same thing. Here we've got Y. Here we've got planned aggregate expenditure. Here we've got Y, here we've got the interest rate, right? And I'm going to draw it for one particular interest rate on the top. So we got planned aggregate expenditure for interest rate equal 3%. And that's just C plus I plus G plus net exports. Right. Okay. And of course we have our equilibrium line. Y is equal to planned aggregate expenditure. And that gives us Y for 3% interest rate. Right? Beautiful, glorious. We're so proud of ourselves now. Okay. I know it's a little bit weird the first time you're learning it, so I'm being a little mean. Like it is genuinely confusing, which is, by the way, the confusing that you're seeing here is trying to bring in more than, like we're putting this together because we want to have more than 2 things going on in one graph, and that's what we're doing here. We're bringing in the money market, which is 2 lines, and we're bringing in the goods market, which is 2 lines, and it becomes confusing, right? Does it not? It does. It becomes confusing, and that is just saying this is a limitation of both our graph paper, the fact that it's 2-dimensional, and our little tiny brains, that this is difficult, right? Which is one of the reasons, and if you think about, if we're being serious about the economy, there's more than 2 things going on. It's not just the goods market and the money market, right? There's the goods market and the bonds market and the futures market and the shoe market. There's a whole bunch of markets, and each one of these are going to bring in their graphs. We're going to have to combine them in some way. Clearly, this is a sucker's game, right? 2 is we're stretching our brain power and our graphing power. You can see it already. We start bringing in 3, 4, 5 markets. We are well and truly screwed in terms of understanding it graphically. And so what we do instead is we do it mathematically. Okay? And this is one of the reasons we shift from graphs at the beginning to more and more math as we go along, because with math, it's easy to bring in 12 markets. This has got 12 equations, 12 unknowns. It's a mess, but you can solve them out. But with graphs, you don't even know where to start doing that graph. Okay? So the complication and dizziness you're seeing is actually telling us that as we start adding this level of complication, we really should start thinking about doing it mathematically rather than graphically. But here we can do it graphically, but we're pushing our limits, right? So, okay. So here I've got that, and that meant that for 3% interest rate, we had this level of output, right? And presumably there's a whole IS curve that goes through that. If we tried different interest rates, if we tried a lower interest rate, investment would be higher, output would be higher, and we would move down here. If we tried a higher interest rate, investment would be lower, output would be lower. We'd have a point like this. But I'm just going to do the 3% one to keep things clear, hopefully clear. Right? All right. So that's what happened. Now let's suppose something changes. Well, we already know what happens if we change interest rate. We move along this curve, right? Because that's what we graphed. But if anything else that matters for people's spending changes, this is going to shift. And so in particular, we can look at, for example, if government spending goes up. If we decide to increase our government spending, what happens? Still, we got the 3% interest rate. So we're still with 3% interest rate, but now government spending is higher. Okay? Which means planned aggregate expenditure at 3% is no longer this, because it's C plus I plus G plus net exports. And we made G go up. So for any level of income, there's going to be more aggregate expenditure than there was before, right? Because G went up, and G is part of aggregate expenditure. So investment will be the same. We're keeping the same 3% interest rate, but we're keeping the same income, but we're increasing government spending, so now there's more spending. Consumers spending what they were before, firms investing the amount that they were before, foreigners doing whatever crazy thing they were doing before, and now government is spending more. So overall, we got more stuff being produced, right? More expenditure. So this line, this planned aggregate expenditure line, for every level of income, that's going to shift up. I is still equal 3%, but G has gone up. So the whole thing shifts vertically upward. Okay. Any level of income, we spend more than we did before. Okay. I have more rapt audience than I had for the entirety of Fisher Gray. It's glorious. It's glorious. Oh, life is good. I feel like Taylor Swift. Paying attention to me. Well, yeah, anyway. Okay, so we get a new equilibrium point. And output, this is still y for 3% interest rate. I equals 3%. But G has gone up. Right? So when G goes up, and we had this last year, when G goes up, holding everything else in the world constant, output goes up. Right? Miracle of the multiplier, all that. Which means for this same level of interest rate, now we have this new level of output out here. Okay? It shifted to the right. It shifted the IS curve to the right when we increased government spending. At the same level of interest rate, now we have more stuff produced. Okay? Because government's buying stuff too, and therefore more stuff gets produced. Okay. Yeah?
What does it say, like 3% but G something?
G increased.
G?
Increased. Arrow up.
That's G.
Yeah, G goes up. So it's like the new equilibrium we get if G is higher than it was before. Okay? Everything else exactly the same, but we increase government spending. Okay? Just more people buying. Everyone that was buying before was still buying, and now the government's buying more stuff. Yeah?
I see it's a straight line or it's just comments.
We don't know. It's very unlikely in real life to be a straight line. In books, you'll often see it as a straight line. All we know is it's downward sloping. It depends on exactly how things affect each other.
Output is equal to P, right? P8.
Uh-huh.
And stop at 1, then should be straight line.
So it depends on everything. Like we could do the math. Like we won't, but we could. But in particular, it's going to depend on the shape of how interest rate changes. No. Just on graph. Like what's going on here is we are increasing, say, the interest rate. And so investment is going to fall. If investment falls at a constant rate for every 1%, then it should be a straight line. But if when you're very low and you increase interest rates, investment falls a lot, and then later on it falls by less, then it won't be a straight line. So it depends on all this stuff. It depends on how consumption depends on your income. We've assumed it's straight line with the marginal propensity to consume. Real life, messier, right? And it depends on how investment depends on the interest rate. Is that a straight line? If they're both straight lines themselves, then this will be a straight line. But if one of them is curved and there's no reason to think it's not, then it won't be. Okay. So you'll often see it drawn as a straight line. You'll often see it drawn as a curve, kind of like this. For our point of view here, it doesn't matter. But what we do know is that it's downward sloping. Okay. Now, reality, we can say, like for sure, it's not really a straight line, right? Because nothing is strictly linear in real life. Right? And so none of the things that are going in, marginal propensity to consume is an assumption, a simplifying assumption. In fact, there's probably a curvature to our consumption function as well. There's almost certainly a curvature to this investment function as well. And so this thing is bound to be curved in some way or another. But not getting into it, it's not important for us in this model because we don't really believe the model deep down anyway. Right? It's a way of getting at the right answer kind of quickly and to see how markets are interconnected in a quick way. So if you draw it linear, I'm happy. Just don't draw it upward sloping. And I'm good. Or flat. Okay. So at the same level of interest rate, now we have more output than we had before. Right? Because government buying stuff, and that causes there to be output. Okay? And we could have done that for any interest rate. We did it for the 3% one. But we also could have done it for the 5% one, and it would have shifted to the right. We could have done it for the 2% one, and it would have shifted to the right. So when government spending goes up, the whole IS curve, S with higher G, the whole thing is going to shift to the right. The whole IS curve is going to shift to the right. That is, at the same level of interest rate, you're going to have more output than you had before because there's more spending going on than there was before. Before government wasn't spending so much, now they're spending more. So everything else the same, there's going to be more spending than before. Okay. Now, one thing I want to caution you about, and you will see in many books they will get this wrong. I do not want you to get this wrong. I will be very upset and peeved if you get this wrong. Very often you'll see graphs where we got Y, we got I, we got the IS curve, and then they say government spending goes up, and they'll draw it like this, IS prime, and they'll have an arrow going out like that. That is wrong. That is not just, it's the same, like that graph and this graph are the same, but the story is very different, right? And the graphs are representing a story. The graphs, the math, and the story all have to match, right? There are three ways of telling the same thing, getting at the same underlying economic thing. The story, the math, the graphs all have to be consistent with each other. Okay? We're not going to have math for this, so the story and the graphs have to be consistent. And our story here is government spending goes up. Keeping all else the same, what happens to output? Right? Our story here is the interest rate we're thinking of as determined in the money market. Right? That's a financial variable. It's determined by financial things. Now, clearly the goods market is going to have an influence on it, but fundamentally it's a financial market thing. And so for a particular interest rate, how much output are we going to get? Okay? We're not thinking of the goods market as being the main determinant of interest rates. They affect them, sure, but interest rates are determined in the money market, in the financial markets, and the goods markets take them as given. And that's how we drew that IS curve, right? We said, what if the interest rate is 5%? What's output? What if the interest rate is 3%? What's output? What if it's 2%? What's output? So we're doing the same thing with the new IS curve as well. We're saying if it's 5%, what's the new output? If it's 3%, what's the new output? If it's 2%, what's the new output? And what you get there is a very out of focus graph. See? Even the computer is dizzy. They have like a focus button. Focus, man, focus. Okay. So it really is a case of this curve shifts right. It doesn't shift up. It doesn't shift out. It shifts to the right because that's how we constructed the curve, taking interest rates as outside of this market and seeing how much output we want to make. Right, so shifting right is consistent with the story. Shifting up or out, even though it's graphically identical, is not the same story. Okay. And you get this because people kind of memorize it. They don't go through the story each time, and then it looks the same, but it's not the same. Right? It shifts to the right. Okay. All right, let's do another one, just for fun. We'll do the LM curve next time. It's too late in the class to do it from scratch, so let's just do another example of this. Let's suppose, now let's change it. Let's say net exports go down, right? So people stop buying Irish products. There's a whole round of mad cheese disease. Nobody wants to eat Irish cheese. And so we can't sell cheese to the French anymore. It's sad. They're just not buying our stuff. Okay? So what happens? Well, to start this out, we say, where were we before? Right? Before this happened. Because models, this is Y, this is planned aggregate expenditure, this is Y, this is interest rate. Models are not reality. They're a representation of reality. They're a way of thinking about reality in kind of a structured way. They work best if you start them in equilibrium. Right? So we're not thinking that in real life the world's all in equilibrium at all times, but the models tend to, unless you have a good reason otherwise, to work best starting in equilibrium and staying. So how were we before net exports fell? Well, there was Y equals planned aggregate expenditure, and there was a planned aggregate expenditure line for some interest rate, say 5% interest rate, which means that was output when interest rate was 5%, and that gave us a point. Right, with a 5% interest rate, that gave us this planned aggregate expenditure, C plus I plus G plus net exports, had our initial exports. Let me write that down. C plus I of 5% plus G plus net exports. Right. And if we had tried other interest rates, if we tried higher interest rates, we would have gotten less output. If we tried lower interest rates, we would have gotten more output. So that gives us a whole IS curve looking something like this, downward sloping. Okay. All the combinations of interest rate and output so that the goods market is in equilibrium. Okay. I just have one of them graphed at the top, but we could try different interest rates, shift the curves, and trace out that whole line. So there we are. And now, the foreigners, man, they stopped buying our stuff. What is wrong with those people? Anyway, foreigners, what can you do? They're going to be foreign. And so net exports goes down. And what happens? Well, at the moment, at this particular interest rate, this 5%, that means this is going to go down, right? Net exports. And so at that level of interest rate, now people are going to spend less than they did before. And that's true at every level of income for that interest rate. So we get planned aggregate expenditure, 5%, with lower net exports. This whole curve shifts down. With no income, our expenditure shifts down. When we have high income, our expenditure shifts down. It's unrelated to our income, this shift, because it's something the foreigners did, right? So the whole curve just shifts parallelly down because the foreigners aren't buying our stuff anymore. Okay. Right. So that means that at this same interest rate, the same 5% interest rate, now output has fallen to this. And so our new output is here. Same 5% interest rate, but less output than we had before because the foreigners aren't buying our stuff. Right? And that's true for each and every interest rate. If we had a 2% interest rate and we're way out here, once the foreigners stop buying our stuff, there's going to be lower output than there was before. And so this whole curve is just shifting to the left. At the same interest rate, at each and every interest rate, we are now having less output than we had before. Just shifts to the left. It's the exact opposite of what we had when government spending went up. And we'd get the same thing, obviously, if government spending went down. Or we get the other one if net exports went up. It's just going to shift this curve left and right. And that's going to shift our curve left and right. That's all we got. It doesn't give us anything yet because we don't have the LM curve yet, so we don't have equilibrium or anything to talk about it, but that's what's going to happen. It's going to shift the curve left and right. Okay, I will let you go and see you on Friday.